Welcome to this talk on how to apply design thinking to research in aging. Uh, Thank you very much to Laura for extending this invitation to do this talk on something that is something I have a great passion and interest in. And as Laura had pointed out, I am a teaching stream faculty member here, and design is something I've come by through both academic practice, but also in industry, having worked as a mechanical designer in automotive as well as in software design prior to coming on board at Mac as a teaching stream professor. So let me tell you a little bit about what I want to cover today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about design thinking. And I'm going to do that in a way that I think is probably the most illustrative. I'm going to take a project that I worked on with some students, and I'll kind of walk you through it, give you an idea of what we did and how we approached the problem. And I'm going to explain how that is an example, but it's by hardly an example of all that's possible, and explain perhaps how design thinking is quite actually a broad approach. And then after that, I'd like to go and explain to you perhaps a couple of approaches where design thinking approaches have been or can be applied in research. And I'm going to also illustrate that with some examples. And after that, I'll bring the talk to a close, and I'll answer any questions that you might have. So on to the next slide. So what is design thinking? It's certainly a term that we've heard a lot I've heard it in the news. I've seen it in business. It's become quite a common term. It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And design is different in different disciplines and in different professions. But at the core of it, there's some key elements and principles and methods or ways of thinking that appear to be common to all. And I'll explain those after the example. Now, I'm going to start this example. It's actually going to go through a number of slides here. And I'm going to start with Sandy here. So the project I'm going to describe is one that related to aging. It's a product or technology projects. Not all projects coming out of design thinking are necessarily technology approaches. So don't let that throw you off if you're not somebody who's interested in a technology approach. So this project was done back in the fall of 2017 with 3 graduate students enrolled in the Masters of Engineering Design in my school. Interestingly enough, 2 were mechanical engineers, mechanical backgrounds. Actually, one was aerospace, one was mechanical, and the third was an industrial designer. And so this is one of the key elements frequently of design thinking approaches, is even the design team itself bringing people together from different backgrounds, right? And my challenge for the students here was to go out actually and find a client, which was quite an interesting and challenging task for them. And they ended up working with Ms. Sandy Mugford, with someone I've worked with in the past. She was involved in a workshop back in, I think it was the fall of 2015 for MIRA. Absolutely fantastic individual to work with. But we came to her with an idea that we're going to address some mobility issue that she might have, but we did not assume we knew what it was. And so this is another kind of key element of design thinking, is that process of actually determining issues and problems is actually part of the design process. And frequently that's not something we assume. All right, so key problem that Sandy faced. I've worked with Sandy for a number of years, and I can remember meeting her the first time, and she is an incredibly resilient and interesting person to talk to. And she has lived with rheumatoid arthritis for over 5 decades. Quite a feat, and it's a level of chronic pain that she must endure that most of us have no idea about. But this made for and one of the things we found about working with Sandy, not all people we work with and all the people we engage in the design projects are the same. Sometimes clients we involve are not as easy to work with as others. Sandy is one of those people that was fantastic to work with, very, very interesting, very engaged, always willing to provide answers and feedback, and had lots of ideas of her own. And sometimes that's not the case. Now, the problem, what the students were challenged to do is go out and take a look at a situation and try to find an issue, a problem. Now, problems in around mobility and aging are not difficult to find. But my goal here with the students and this project was to actually go a little bit deeper and actually find a problem that perhaps was less obvious. So we were looking for what we call an aha moment, some new connection, some connection, some epiphany that gives us some new insight that leads to an interesting or better project. And so what we did here is the students go out and they follow a something similar to an ethnographic approach. So they engage Sandy in a discussion over her grocery shopping experience, something seemingly mundane. And they would ask her through an interview process to kind of describe her experiences. So as much as possible to get her to direct the conversation. And she walked through her experiences at the grocery store, and there were numerous issues. So this on the one hand, sometimes walking through these experiences helps us validate problems that we think are already there. But what we were looking here to find something that perhaps was not a problem that she had been thinking about or not one that was already addressed. In other cases, we might look for that. Now, after about an hour or two of discussion here, and one of the students asked the question, wait a second, there's something really odd about your story, Sandy. You're going out there and you're going to a grocery store with a car, and instead of using the grocery store grocery cart, you're pulling one out of your own trunk. Why? And she looked at him and said, oh, I didn't think about that. That's just what I always do. So they probed a little further, and it became apparent that what she'd been doing this for years, and the reason she'd been doing it is because of the grocery cart she goes to, or the grocery store she goes to, as you can see in the photo, it requires the use of a coin to unlock the grocery cart. And given her RA, that was very difficult. So this was our little aha moment, and this generated a lot of the rest of the project. So although this isn't something brand new, it wasn't something our participant here or our client actually thought about. And it was a job of our students, our designers, to actually ask the right questions and make the connection to come up with this aha moment. So from there, once they've done that piece of, we'll call it empathy, going out and having essentially an affective experience, having an experience with the individual, entering their world, immersing in it with them through that conversation. Sometimes we do that through observation and other methods, and then they begin to connect and find meaning within that conversation. Eventually, they'll step out of the story and start, in an intellectual, cognitive fashion, going back and thinking about what they saw and heard, right? And that's where the aha moment came from. So once they got to that point, they have some idea. Now they have an idea what a problem might be, and what some of the challenges that Sandy's facing, and they have an idea of what's important to her and what's not important to her. So one of the issues here for her was that this was all about independence, remaining or maintaining her independence in the face of the challenges as RA is providing her with. From there, we went to sort of an ideation phase. And here's one of the early sketches that the students drew up. As you can see, this is the benefits of having an industrial designer on the team, is quite capable of doing quite a high quality sketches. And we moved very quickly here from looking at some ideas, and I gave them a whole bunch of approaches on how to actually generate the ideas, into the next phase of prototyping. Now, this is another very fundamental aspect of design thinking. Design thinking is very much solution-oriented, and what we try to do is get students to actually test the solutions fairly quickly, and to do it in a fashion that is low commitment, especially early on. And I've seen this happen with other groups and other design teams, where they might come up with what they feel is a great idea. Then they will go and develop a relatively high fidelity prototype, and that usually encourages or requires a significant amount of time, effort, and money to do that. And then they go back and show it to the user, and they'll learn that there's a whole bunch of things that they missed, and they may all even learn that they misunderstood the problem. But at that point, they're very reluctant to make changes to design because, of course, they've invested substantial amounts of time and money in the prototype. So to avoid that and to continue engaging our user here, our client, we start with low fidelity prototypes. So you can see from the photos here, these are purely cardboard. Very simple, something was mocked up very quickly and in a very short period of time. And in fact, in this particular case, they tried a number of different prototypes at the same time. So the engagement with our user, our client here, client user, doesn't end with that first discovery or that first aha moment, but we're frequently going back again and again with, in this case, sketches or those low fidelity prototypes, which oftentimes acts like 3D prototypes. They're usually not functional. Sometimes they are. They're generally full scale, but they allow for conversation here between Sandy and the design team to try and figure out what she likes, what she doesn't like, what are perhaps issues they haven't discovered, and perhaps validate some of the thoughts and ideas they do have. I've had occasions where teams have gone back to the clients at this point and discovered they got the problem entirely wrong and have to go back and restart their thinking. So what I'm going to have here is a whole bunch more slides kind of showing you some examples of some of this work. So again, this is product-oriented work in this particular case. And you can see, again, Sandy on the right, holding one of these prototype sketches on the left. Another alternative. And so they're trying multiple alternatives, and the goal here is not just to pick one, but to actually use them to learn. Yet another one. And another. Each trying some different element of the design, the function, the interaction with the user. And some would say this is really about a human interface design. In a sense, it is. And then they did pick, at some point, they're going to have to make some decisions, take the ideas they have come up with, the new learnings they have come up with, and generate some more ideas. So the process tends to be highly iterative, especially where you're engaging a client. And from there, they upped it to what we might call medium fidelity prototyping. Here, these parts are actually constructed using a 3D printer. As you can see, a different number of different things they tried, and they're all printed out of plastic in for not quite cheap, but relatively quick. They tried a number of different ideas. As you can see on the left here, they've tried some fashion of device with the coin in it, trying to explore why that might be a good idea or not. And on the right, they actually dropped the idea of including the coin, which is a required part of using the locking mechanism. And one of the things they went back and also, again, they went out and engaged the store owner too to ask them if they had any issues with this. Because the point of the lock, of course, is that nobody takes the card away because they might lose a coin. So they were talking to, they may, through the process, engage more stakeholders. And from here, they went and, again, continuing to iterate and work with the client. They iterated on the design here to a final, what they thought was a final design, and actually now constructed it out of something a little more expensive and a little more time consuming. They milled it out of a block of aluminum, which might be kind of visible in that middle slide. In the bottom two pictures there, you can see them, actually the CNC milling machine they used at the, I think it was at the McMaster Automotive Research Center at the McMaster Innovation Park. So this is a very typical process of design and the way things are done. Let me show you a couple more here. So this is actually a picture of the final product that they use. The students today are actually taking that product and they're taking it out and they're trying to market it. So they've been looking for a way of producing this in a fairly large number and selling it because they see that others would be able to use it. So one of the funny things I found about design thinking, one of the things researchers will come back to me and say, so but your design is for one person or for a very small group. How do we know that actually is a problem for a lot of people? I've yet to come across a problem where we've discovered with one person that isn't actually affect many others. And two, this is one way we get some level of depth in understanding actual people's needs, concerns, and eliciting some of that tacit knowledge that people have. Now, go on to the next slide. Now, let me take that example that I just talked through and try to put it into a bit of a broader context, because I expect that most of the people that are listening here are researchers. I'm sure there are probably some community members as well. You probably won't be designing a product quite like the way I did it, or a product at all, but design thinking has broader applicability. And let me kind of expand that example into something a little bit broader. And I'm going to borrow a little bit from the academic literature here. So design thinking, as much as it's sort of become something you hear in the news and particularly in business circles, I'm now told that virtually every top-tier accounting firm, which they frequently now all usually offer management consulting services, also have a design thinking team on board, because design thinking has become a very big thing in organizations, business design, and of course innovation. Right? But a lot of the thinking behind this came back in the 90s from Nigel Cross, who went and actually studied designers from a variety of professions, whether it was industrial design, architecture, engineering, or elsewhere. And he came back with about these four very common ways that all the designers thought. And he put this in context of how it is different from how researchers would think, particularly from a natural sciences context. So designers are typically looking at ill-defined, open-ended, or what are known as wicked problems that are quite challenging, that where maybe you're testing solutions will reveal new aspects of the solution. And that's actually an idea that came from urban planning. Solution-focused searching strategies for designers are very much focused on searching and testing ideas. As we saw through the process I showed you, they were constantly trying new ideas as they went through. That's partially what makes it iterative, and partially because, of course, they're getting feedback and new insights as they go along, as they test those ideas. That's what the wicked problem is. The other piece of here, a key piece, is the what-if thinking, is that the challenge here is to ask bigger questions and to create something, as opposed to perhaps focusing on deductive and inductive approaches in finding a solution. And lastly is the utilization of visual modeling. And that I've learned actually means a lot of different things in different professions and different kinds of design projects. But it could mean anything from sketching. It could mean for an engineer a back-of-the-envelope calculation or a computer simulation. It could mean testing a design through role-playing. So it's not necessarily just physical product. And this is really where design thinking has moved away from thinking about design about an artifact or a thing to thinking about design as a set of thinking processes, interaction methods, and collaboration approaches about creating some artifact or process, designing an organization or a policy, or any number of other potential uses. So another way to look at it is through Bruce Mao's eyes. And Bruce Mao is a rather well-known Canadian designer who does all kinds of very, very exciting work. And he sees, and this is actually coming from a CBC podcast last year, where he defines design, essentially define an outcome in a very broad and comprehensive and holistic sense, and then systematically execute that vision. A more generalized approach to thinking about design thinking. I'd also like to bring to attention another paper here. This is, again, a little more on the engineering side, and this might be most relevant to people who are perhaps coming from a technology background or interested in a technology or engineering approach to design thinking. Written back in 2001 by a Stanford researcher. And in engineering particularly, we train people to think about design in terms of function. What does it do? So a bridge performs the function of essentially holding up its own weight and whoever travels over top of it. Now, over the last probably 10 or 15 years, as design and engineering has become more important, people start thinking about usability more so. So how is that bridge going to afford the travel for somebody crossing it? How easy is it to use the app on your phone? All these usability questions have become important. But really what's become more important here, and I think this is really interesting to not just technology and engineering researchers and thinkers, but to probably everyone, is the meaning of the design. And what I mean by meaning is that we've learned that design, thinking of design not just as working in a normative way within understood ways that people are going to use it, designing for what we expect it to do, but understanding that designs nowadays, and we've seen this particularly in the world of software and telecommunications, designs also affect human behavior. And people are now thinking about in various areas, and I see this particularly, let's say, in the MIT Media Lab, how we think about the meaning of the design as perhaps a starting point of a project, not necessarily how we improve the function of something. So meaning is really fundamentally a big consideration here. And I'm going to show you a project in a few minutes that really underscores how actually the researchers and designers thought about the meaning of the project here. Another example here, if I'm going back to Stanford again, there's an individual there by the name of Sean Fulmer at the Shape Lab. So if you look at shape.stanford.edu, and his research area is very much a design area. He's a mechanical engineering there, but what he's looking at is human-computer interfaces and he asks a meaning question. He says, what would it mean if a human-computer interface could change its shape? And not really a typical sort of product or engineering question. And so he's looked at different ways of changing the shape of things and what that might mean to people. As a simple example, funny enough, he was apparently invited to a Milan design show a couple of years ago, and he showcased a kitchen counter that changed shape. And what he taught it to do was to create affordances for the users. That is, so that people would show up. So if you came to your counter with, let's say, your iPad or your tablet and put it on the counter, it would automatically change shape to help you to hold that tablet up. So he was looking at technologies that could create change in shape and what they might mean to people. So it's a whole new way of thinking about design. And I think it's particularly important where we're applying design to research. Okay. So again, thinking about design more broadly. Design came out of thinking about engineering, architecture, industrial design, urban planning, but today it's moved into a number of other areas. So we've looked at it in business. Roger Martin, who was a former dean of the Rotman School at U of T, was looking at how integrative thinking is used in business. How do business leaders use design thinking to solve complex problems in business? And they're not designing things, they're designing usually organizations. They're talking about people and behavior. IDEO, which is a very well-known product design company based in California and works very closely with Stanford, developed what's called a human-centered design process, which is very close to what I was showing you today as my example, but they go in and they use this particularly in developing countries, but also design products. There's a whole host of processes called user design, centered design, co-design, participatory design, etc. that have been adopted in industry for product design. And I've also had some recent discussions with people around using design thinking in public policy. I have a former student who now works for the federal government, and he was asked to actually put together an innovation lab there, where he would go out into the field, working with the people who are receiving services from the government to look at how to improve them, how to change them. And sometimes the solutions he comes up with are very simple. He worked recently with a group of people looking at why certain old age benefits were not being utilized or accessed at the rate that they were expected to. And he went and spent a couple of months actually talking to people on the front line to find out why. Came with some very interesting insights, and he came back, and his solution was, you need to change these forms. And you're going to solve your problems. That was an unusually inexpensive solution. So not necessarily technology. Okay. Let me give you a little bit of an idea of sort of a generalized process here and where design comes from. So this is sort of a model that I frequently use, that solutions or innovations frequently in design come from an intersection of looking at people needs, that empathy piece, the very beginning of the process, understanding where there might be opportunities in terms of business or organizational change, to make potential solutions viable, and then where those solutions may be oftentimes technically feasible, but there may be other forms of feasibility that need to be considered. And design is very typical like this. It is integrating those different areas together is where something new comes about. It's rarely going to be just one of those pieces. So second piece of this process, another way of perhaps looking at a more linear way, and this is rather the example I showed you, where we spent some time identifying issues. We didn't use observation in this case, but we did work directly through with the client through interviews, forming those insights, defining the needs, and then going through a synthesis and design phase where we're generating ideas, testing them, and trying to eventually validate and finalize a solution. It's a fairly typical process. Now, the tools we used that I showed you were fairly fundamental, pretty basic stuff, looking at things like semi-structured interviews, forms of prototyping, sketching, etc. But that's a very small slice of the tools available out there. Right? So typically through the process, you could use a wide range of tools depending on the kinds of solution space you have and the kinds of ways you might want to collect your understanding or develop your understanding of the needs of individuals. So things like experience mapping, brainstorming, mind mapping, scenario writing, stakeholder analysis, behavioral mapping, storyboarding is frequently an effective way of making sense of problems and even visualizing complex organizational solutions, role playing, all kinds of forms of prototyping, focus groups, etc. So some of these are appropriate for product or technology-oriented approaches. Others are more broadly usable and valuable. And I do have some references at the end of the presentation, both academic and for a general audience, including one book where you will find over 100 different methods that may be useful in a design thinking process. Okay. All right, so let me talk a little bit about this. So you've seen an example. I'm trying to give you an idea of how it's not just product. It can be, the design process can be used in many other ways. And now let me talk to you about a couple of different approaches, how we've seen this done with research. And these are not exhaustive by any stretch of the imagination, but they are, I think, helpful to give you an idea of how it might fit. Because, of course, I don't expect most researchers are going to be aiming to produce a commercializable product at the end. But there are elements of design thinking, I think, here that can be quite valuable. All right. So I've borrowed a couple of these two terms that I'm going to be using here from a paper on integrating end user perspective, on actually interdisciplinary design or interdisciplinary work by Nicotina, and the references later in the slides. So the first one is integrating or working with end users in what's known as contextualizing. That is, where do we include end users in the research to make it more relevant to other end users? So where perhaps the end users, perhaps you're not designing per se here, but you're involving users in ways, or end users or stakeholders in ways that you traditionally wouldn't have in a project. Why would that be valuable? And an example of how that perhaps is done, or where it's done. The other way is where there is an element of design in the research. And we had a wonderful example I'll talk about from a seminar MIRA that was from a seminar, or a MIRA seminar on Tuesday of this week, which I'll explain. So contextualization is the first approach, is a method of embedding any disciplinary material in the fabric of time, culture, and personal experience. So in a sense, if you look back at the project I showed you, contextualization was almost really the first thing we did. We sat down and tried to understand the individual, the place, the context, their needs, their values, their experiences. Right? So one way I've seen this happen is this came from another paper, and this was actually brought up in Julia Abelson's MIRA workshop on January 23rd of this year, called Engaging and Partnering with Users in Research. And there's an example here from a group of researchers who worked in cancer care and who had actually brought on cancer patients to be part of the research team. So they weren't simply participants in the research from whom you were collecting data, but they're actually involved in discussions on the research questions. They were involved in collecting the data. They were also involved in making sense of some of the results and then communicating those back to community afterwards. Right? And so what they found in this sort of patient-centered project, including the patient collaborators, and they literally called them scientific experts, and they had the opportunity to influence qualitative research and observational study. And one of the things they found is that, first of all, bringing these patients in made it much easier to connect with other patients who were going to actually be the participants from whom they were going to be collecting data. It also changed their view as to perhaps what some of the things that were important in research were, because the patients were giving a point of view that was not coming from a scientific context, right? And they were able to refute some of the criticism they received actually in the grant application. So again, I have this reference to this paper at the end. You may be interested in just reading through it and how this particular team did it. But by bringing in the users in a fashion that we do, somewhat like a fashion we do in design projects, they got a very different sort of research at the end, and one that was probably a little bit more impactful on the end users. So the other approach is problem centering. It's essentially design, and where some aspect of design is actually done in the project. And there's a number of reasons why you might do this and where it may interact with the research. And the example I'm going to use here is from the seminar that we had on the 20th of March, so a couple of days ago, on designing for dementia user-centered case study. And I give this one because this is actually a wonderful example of one approach where design thinking was central to the research done here. I'm going to give it a very simple kind of overview of what was done. You can get more information online about this project. But this is a group of 2 researchers from the University of Toronto, a CEO of a company who was involved and interested in the actual design of the device, and obviously its potential commercial application, and a long-term care caregiver and manager. So this is, again, the interdisciplinary team is key. This is what we try to do in our design projects, wherever possible. It brings different aspects or different perceptions to all aspects of the project. And what they were looking to do was to design a device to help manage responsive behavior for dementia people with dementia in long-term care facilities. Right. So responsive behavior being restlessness and agitation to verbal and everything from restlessness and agitation to verbal and physical aggression. Right. And they're trying to do this in a way that trying to understand what are perhaps some meaningful activities that could be provided to dementia patients, and working with the staff and the experts in this area to design something that is essentially an intervention. The technology here isn't particularly new, but it combined aspects of knowledge on the ground of the people, access to the participants, knowledge of obviously psychology, and a little bit of technological knowledge to put this together, plus obviously the funding and the necessary skills to actually building something like this. And they did some initial research using methods that they later, I believe, published, but were similar to some of the research methods around involving empathy, whose goal it was to develop empathy for users. And then they took some 18 months to design that device that you see there on the wall. And it went through numerous iterations following a very similar process that I showed you, from low to high fidelity, constantly involving the caregivers, particularly in the facility. And at the end of the day, the main aspect of the research was actually studying the effects and of the device on the people who have dementia, on their families, on the caregivers, and using a whole range of measures and data collection methods. And that's, as I understand, it's still an ongoing project. So this is a great example where researchers and designers, in some sense, have worked together to look at something new and to challenge looking for something meaningful, again, to design and then to use that design as an intervention whose outcomes or effects they were studying and publishing the results from. All right. So looking at the design approach and a couple of different ways of where it might be integrated into research. So the first thing, I just kind of remind you, the intervention is probably a better way, probably best to describe it. As an engineer, I might describe it as an artifact or a product or a process. But I think more generally, if you're involving design thinking, you're designing some form of probably an intervention. That could be a program, a policy, a technology, any number of possible things. It doesn't have to be limited to a product. Prototyping, what piece of the process you might use may not be the entirety of the process I showed you. There may be bits of pieces that may be valuable to you. The prototyping process, for example, may be particularly valuable, but you may not be aiming as a researcher to take it to the end point of a commercializable product. Probably not, right? What you may find too, if you're involving some aspect of design, that these research insights can both drive the design. So doing the initial empathy work of collecting understanding about understanding people, your patients, your other stakeholders, may drive insights that may change your understanding of the research. But we've also found in more complex, some projects where the technology is more complex, where new understandings of the problem will drive new technological problems. That probably was not the case in the example I just showed you, but if you take a look at some of the projects you see, particularly at MIT Media Lab, you'll see exactly that. Right? One that I saw recently is a digital construction platform, which was actually featured in an article on the CBC a while ago. And obviously another area for researchers is taking a look at and studying the effects of the intervention at the endpoint, depending on, of course, what that might be. Right? And in general, design thinking really strongly emphasizes the interaction with end users and stakeholders frequently throughout the design process. And so there may be opportunities here for trying some research in new ways where you might be maybe you could be partnering with end users, other stakeholders in a project from beginning to end, and that may have some very interesting effects on where it takes your project. Okay, thank you. That's the end of my presentation per se here. Just to show you, I do have a couple of slides here with some of the articles I drew some of the material from, and we'll make that available, I think. And then I also have some more general reading here. So if perhaps you're just interested in learning more about design thinking, here's some books from a number of different perspectives. Tim Brown from IDEO is very much a human-centered design and product design perspective. Bill Buxton a bit more on the engineering technology side of things. Nigel Cross also a bit more coming from an academic perspective, trying to provide a broad understanding of design. The IDEO Design Kit, really interesting if you want to look at the methods and an actual process in some detail. The book by Martin and Hannington. If you want to reference the design methods, a great list there. And then lastly, a business perspective on design. Sorry. Okay, and that's the end of the presentation.
Thank you, Robert. That's wonderful. That was such a great presentation, and I had jotted down some questions while you were going through, and you've actually answered so many of them as you spoke. So thank you so much for that. I'd like to open the floor to other people for questions, and just to remind everyone, you can enter your questions in the chat window at the bottom right corner of the WebEx window, and make sure that you select all panelists so that we can see the questions that you're entering. And I will just add one question myself just to get things started here. You talked about usability and meaning, and I just wanted to ask you to comment a little bit more about that, because just because something is usable doesn't mean that people actually want to use it or that it actually impacts their life. So can you just comment a little bit on that?
Usability versus meaning. Usability is something we have a great deal of methods for assessing and measuring nowadays. There's a whole area of usability engineering. Any product, let's say like a piece of software, an app will go through some usability testing. Well, they'll put the app in front of users, and then they will actually observe users using it and trying to find problems. but they're not looking to create new meaning. They're not asking how does that change behavior. They simply try to validate or find errors. Where at a meaning level, we're really trying to think about a much broader context as to what that technology how it might impact people in change their behaviors, and how perhaps we should take that into account when we design. I hope that's helpful.
That's great, Robert.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. So let's go to the questions here that the participants have been putting in. So the first question is, what accommodations can or should be made for end users who aren't able to clearly articulate their needs, or who may give conflicting feedback during the design process?
Well, that's complicated. Dealing with end users can be enormously challenging sometimes. So what was the first part of the question? Is it on our chat here? So what was the first part of the question, Laura?
The first part, Robert, is what accommodations can or should be made for end users who aren't able to clearly articulate their needs?
Well, the first thing, whenever we do also work with end users, was in a course or in a research project, we have to go through and, of course, get ethics approval. And that's usually a wonderful way of learning what are sort of consent we would actually need to obtain to be able to protect the privacy and the rights of our users. I suppose that's only a partial answer. Outside of that, we will frequently, if you're doing something like a usability testing, you will generally do this with multiple users with the goal of trying to identify issues. And when we work with users, we sometimes try to go out there and identify new problems or issues, which is very different from trying to go to users and talk to them about trying to validate a design. Right. If we're trying to validate a design, we're certainly going to be probably looking at a significant number of people to talk to. If we're looking at trying to generate issues, we find that we will saturate the number of issues we find fairly quickly after a number of talking to a number of users.
And is this a situation, just to add to that, where you might use more observation as well? So if they can't tell you about their needs, you can spend some time observing people.
Yes, and observation is nothing I talked about. It's something that can be a very powerful method, and it may bring up tacit knowledge and tacit behaviors that people aren't aware of, and that's usually the goal of observational research in design. In fact, the researchers, the Abbey project I described, they actually did a lot of work because the dementia patients aren't able to articulate their needs. The research they did there primarily was through direct and indirect observation of the people who had dementia.
Thank you, Robert. The next question is about different groups of students at the university taking different kinds of degrees. The question is whether or not there are any courses they can take to learn more about this. That's the first part of the question. So maybe I'll stop there.
Yeah, so there are a couple of courses. I'm not sure they're open to everyone yet. I run a first-year course where we involve students from health sciences, life sciences, and engineering. With Drs. Brenda Verkian and Dr. Levay Kajura, so you might want to talk to them. There's also, as I understand it, I'm not, maybe Laura, you know this better. There is a course run by, I believe, Sean Park in health sciences, at a fourth year level.
Yes, this is Innovation by Design, and it's actually not limited to fourth-year students. It's also graduate students, I believe, can take this course, and it's through the Health Leadership Academy, which is a partnership between the DeGroote School of Medicine and the DeGroote School of Business. So there definitely are some opportunities for students to learn a little bit more about this at the university. But the second part of this question, Robert, was about how can engineering department collaborate more with the Health Evidence and Impact Department or other healthcare faculty members?
Is that? I'm assuming that's being asked at a research level, or is that asking from an educational point of view?
I mean, I think from both sides. I think if you involve students, you're looking at an educational component as well. But that would be how I would understand it.
Yeah. So look, maybe I can describe a little bit of my experience of teaching my first-year course, which originally started just as an engineering thing, and eventually I ended up working with Brenda from occupational therapy and Levay from biology. And that's something that evolved over time. One thing I say, building those interdisciplinary relationships wasn't something that happened overnight, but it depended on people who really were interested in doing it and willing to start building those relationships and finding some commonality to what we wanted to do. we both had very much interest in working together to educate students, and in a way that was impactful on community and gave them some of those empathy skills and put the students together. So if you can find that commonality with a researcher in another department, then there's reason for you to sit down and work together, but it's not going to be quick, I wouldn't expect. Ideally, if you can find some area immediately where perhaps you'll clearly have complementary expertise around a given problem. And that's typically the way design works, is around some sort of problem area. So maybe you have kind of one we've kind of thrown around is you're thinking a little bit about something like smart technology in the home. And maybe you want to talk to somebody who has expertise in chronic disease management. And that would be a combination where you could each see that you have a piece of the puzzle to making something a more nuanced and complex approach to dealing with issues around chronic care disease management using technology.
I think, and I would add to that, if I may, Robert, that I think MIRA is one of the platforms that can help support that. So we are asking people to use this type of approach, or the principles driving this approach, in the research projects that we support. And our funding requires interdisciplinary contributions. And so finding a research topic that's within the field of aging might be a way to kind of create some of those partnerships and drive them forward, and you know what I mean, establish a little bit more of a relationship that then could build into other things as well.
Right. Excellent point.
So here's another question. In your experience, what is unique about design thinking targeting older adults compared to targeting people in need, such as patients in general?
So clearly that's also that's a Venn diagram with some intersection area, but working with an older population actually has some tremendous benefits we found. Oftentimes willing to give their time, have a wealth of experience. We found them to frequently really love working with our students. So this is something that you probably won't find with the general patient population. So they're really, in my mind, there's some real benefits working with an older population.
And do you find that the approach itself has to be different a little bit with older adults versus people in general, or patients?
I think the basic approaches are the same. I think you have an opportunity to get them more involved probably, whereas perhaps a patient, it may be very difficult to get them involved deeply as a partner, but more likely as a participant. Whereas somebody, an older adult, more likely you'll get them involved as a participant, as let's say, as a partner in a project, and not just as a participant from whom you're collecting data.
And Robert, are you able to sort of, if you were to give one message to researchers in general about why they should use this approach, what would that message be?
To me, it's impact. By working with the older population, it will expand your understanding of what they need and what you could be doing with them. But I think it also gives researchers an opportunity to of course, provide the great work that you're doing through publication, but also impact communities. And I found that for most people is incredibly rewarding.
And have you noticed a significant impact on the students as well? So have you seen a change in the students after they started taking this course and participated in these engagement opportunities?
Yeah, it was one of the funny things. I would get comments from my colleagues in mechanical engineering in second year who said, wow, the students are so excited about doing design now. So actually involving people with meaningful problems to them and showing students how they might impact those people really has a tremendous impact. Right in the experiences they're having, it becomes motivational, but I think it also changes their perspectives as they progress the rest of their education. And I'm hoping what it does, it also increases their concern for the public good in general.
Thank you very much, Robert. And I think that's all the questions we have. So I will just thank everybody for their participation, and thank you so much, Robert, for your presentation today. And remind everyone that if you'd like to hear more about MIRA or learn more about what we're doing and our funding opportunities, you can visit our website at mira.mcmaster.ca, or you can send us an email at mirainfo@mcmaster.ca. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.